week on Just Solutions. President Joe Biden has nominated Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. The historic announcement means Judge Jackson could be the first black woman to serve on the nation's highest court. Civil rights groups have welcomed the nomination. Our guest today is Holli Holliday, president of Sisters Lead, Sisters Vote. That's an advocacy group that has pushed for a black woman to serve on the Supreme Court. Holli Holliday says representation on the Supreme Court matters, as justices have ruled on every aspect of our lives. So what does the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson mean for the country, but particularly for black women? From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Holli, it's so great to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us on Just Solutions. Of course, this is absolutely historic. In the history of the Supreme Court, there have been 115 justices, and 108 of them have been white men. This is the chance to have the very first black woman serve on the Supreme Court. And as we heard, you have said that representation matters, because when you look at how involved the Supreme Court is in their decisions in every aspect of their life. Take us through what you mean by representation and why it is so significant when it comes to the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. Well, the law is not just about a way for us to govern society. It actually impacts the way in which we live our lives. And so representation matters because we want to ensure that we are both electing and appointing people, and in this case, confirming people who represent the breadth of America, so that when these decisions are being made, all considerations are thought about, and not just in the decision part of it, but even from the beginning of whether or not the Supreme Court even accepts the case to begin with, and the discussions that happen along the journey, being able to question during a hearing period, being able to bring forth questions that really get to the heart of what happens in different Americans' lives. And then finally, and of course, bringing that lived experience to the decision making as well.
Well, that lived experience is so crucial, and that what's also making Judge Brown Jackson's nomination so significant, because her experience as a federal public defender has meant that she has had direct experience working with very often the most vulnerable members of our society who are in the criminal justice system. So when we talk about life experience, it's all of these facets.
Oh, absolutely. So, I talked about her personal experience in terms of being a Black woman living in this country, but you're absolutely correct. She is a highly qualified individual as well, not only served and has really served at all phases of the justice system from all sides, not only just being a federal public defender, which, as you mentioned, protects our most vulnerable community, but also as a federal judge, being approved 3 times by this Senate, and also a member of the United States Sentencing Commission. And frankly, has family members that serve in law enforcement. And so she really is a person who, both from her professional as well as personal side, fits the bill for representation.
And she's been very open about her own life experience and the fact that she's had an uncle who was serving time in prison for drug offenses. I mean, she has very direct experience on all aspects of the criminal justice system. And the fact that, that she has such incredible experience, not just life experience, but she's immensely qualified from her, legal background and education. But what we're seeing in certain corners, particularly from conservative, very right-wing corners, is a questioning. It's like, well, is this just a nomination because we need to tick a diversity box? And we know that these questions will come up in the hearing. We saw it with Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor when she was asked indirectly, or directly, how can you put aside the bias of being a Latina when you're making decisions? We know those questions will be happening as well. So what is your response when we're hearing those questions already? We haven't even gotten to the nomination hearing yet.
Yeah, it really makes me sad. It makes me sad that we're not at a place where we are being more intentional, more respectful, and honoring the decorum and the professionalism that this nominee brings to this to being considered and being and acting as a nominee. I mean, she is, after all, a sitting judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals in one of the most highly respected circuits in the D.C. Circuit. And this is a person who deserves respect. Frankly, she deserves not only the support of Democrats, but the support of all 100 senators. She represents a candidate who is more qualified than at least 4 of our sitting justices were at the time that they were nominated, and did not have to endure this type of treatment. And so you have to think about what is really behind those attacks and those criticisms, and are we really doing the work and really looking out for the greater good of the American people when we don't do a good job of really instead focusing on her experience, her record, her positioning, her judicial ideology. These are things that we should really be focused on. And I believe if we remain focused on that, it will be clear not only to the Senate, but to all American people that she is the ideal choice for the court at this time.
Well, your organization, Sisters Lead, Sisters Vote, works to empower Black women to take leadership positions, running for elected office and otherwise. And I know right now you're doing a survey of Black women who ran in the 2020 elections to find out what their experiences were. And I know you're actively looking for people to contact you. And so we would encourage people to do that if they've had that experience. But what are you hearing from Black women who are trying to take these leadership positions, whether they're running for office or other public servants positions? What are you hearing about the barriers that they're facing, very much in the context of what we've talked about, the barriers that Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson will be facing as well in her nomination hearing?
Yeah, sadly, Judge Jackson is yet another Black woman who faces, I call it the discredit, disrespect, and dishonor tour. That sometimes that many Black women, especially Black women who are seeking historic offices, face. And so what that looks like is personal attacks. What that looks like is attacks around family, even children who may have had struggles that frankly most American families have to deal with, especially if you've been pushed and are a part of marginalized communities. We see them misquoting and misrepresenting their experience, their record, their opinions, and the way in which they approach a situation. What we don't see is real scrutiny over their professional records, real scrutiny over the impact that they've had in the positions that they've held, real scrutiny on how their service might benefit America and the communities in which they serve. And that's the type of scrutiny that we invite. But sadly, we're still living in a space, frankly, where Black women in particular are experiencing discrimination at the intersection of both race and gender. And unfortunately, they're getting it with both barrels. And that's why we do the work that we do.
And the playing field is in no way level. They have to prove themselves even more than other candidates for these positions in terms of their qualifications. As you said, they're battling the intersection of racism and sexism.
Oh, absolutely. And on the whole, and what our survey showed is that compared to their counterparts, and we're still in the middle of collecting data, but the early results are definitely demonstrating that compared to their counterparts, Black women are infinitely more qualified and experienced. Now, we both know, as does the American public, that the legal qualifications for almost any office in this country, including the Supreme Court, under the law, are relatively low. But what we need in terms of experience and being able to deal with the complex issues that are presented both in law for the courts and policy for our legislatures really require someone who is learned, invested. And I think as much as we care about learned and invested, we also care about people who care about our community, who are thinking about the fact that behind those policies, they are impacting people. And that's the kind of leadership that we see with Black women.
Well, we would love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching and your thoughts on this historic Supreme Court nomination, but also these other issues that we're touching on here, the very many barriers that are in place for specifically Black women who are trying to step into those roles of public leadership. You can drop us a comment or connect with us on social media. Well, Holli, tying all of this, the Supreme Court nomination and indeed the work of the Supreme Court, back to the real essence of the job that you're doing with your organization, Sisters Lead, Sisters Vote, which is around voting rights. We have done extensive coverage on Supreme Court decisions around access to the polls, whether it's gerrymandering and the recent case with Alabama and of course other states tackling this, but also the Supreme Court's role in upholding or not upholding voting rights. And so when we look at the prism of voting rights, how important is this nomination?
Well, listen, we are not under core protections today because of the Supreme Court. The Shelby versus Holder decision literally stripped away the enforcement rights that existed prior to that case. And that was a decision made by the Supreme Court. And as a result, these laws that we see now running rampant, especially through the South, it's no accident that we're seeing those in places that previously would have had to apply for pre-clearance, would have had to have a scrutiny level from the federal government through the Justice Department, and now are doing exactly what we feared they would do. So they're really proving why we need those protections and why we need those laws. That certainly is the most direct way. But let's also think of it from another way. The reason that we're even in this position also has a political connotation. Black women have been one of the most loyal demographics in voting for the last, really since the early 2000s, if not before. And they continue to not only show up and vote. And what we recognize as Sisters Lead, Sisters Vote is it's the vote that has allowed for our leadership to flourish. And so if we are to continue to be represented through our vote, that we also need to show up and be represented through our leadership. And the Supreme Court is yet another place where we're seeking to do that.
Of course, we saw absolutely record turnout in the 2020 elections, especially in some of those states that you mentioned. And I'd like to talk about one of those states, Georgia. And we had one of your board members, Ketanji Brown of Black Voters Matter, join us right on the day that it was January 6th of last year, but before the events unfolded. But what we were discussing that day was the historic Senate runoff elections, and how the massive turnout of Black voters of color, and how Black women had really been the backbone of that effort in those states. What we've now seen subsequently is a real backlash in some of these states, particularly Georgia, with some of these laws that have been passed through the state legislature. And as we are heading into the 2022 midterm election year, I want to talk about the impact of some of those. So what has played out in Georgia since 2020 and those historic turnouts of voters?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just ahead of the 2020 election, what we saw, somewhat influenced by the pandemic, but not exclusively, is we really saw the greatest example of full access to the ballot in the election, both in the 2020 election as well as in the 2021 runoff. And our point that we've been making for decades was finally proven. And that is, when Americans are given access to the ballot, they will vote. When their access to the ballot is not restricted, when accommodations are made, you will see a full vote of Americans. And by the way, not for nothing, that is not just Americans who happen to vote Democrat. That was also Americans who vote in any political party. Republicans, Democrats, and independents all saw a significant rise in the number of voters who came out and supported their candidates' causes and issues. And so that's where we started. But in this particular case, the Democratic Party certainly was able to turn its voters out a little bit more thoroughly. And the backlash that you speak of in a Republican-controlled state legislature and really state government, period, has really pushed back hard. And it's no accident that the things that they've gone after most have been around access and accommodation. Access and accommodation are the things that they have rolled back and restricted. And again, without enforcement from the federal government because of the Supreme Court, other than moving legislation at the federal level, our remedies are really getting slim. We're not out of the fight, and we're still looking for a federal legislative solution, even if it may be more discreet than we had hoped. But it does mean that we're still searching for protection.
Well, during the State of the Union address this week, President Biden did call on those listening members of Congress to pass the John Lewis Act. But of course, there does not seem to be a way forward with that federal legislation. So getting back to what states can do to protect the vote, or rather in a more sinister way, what they are doing to suppress the vote. In Georgia, as you mentioned, so much of that turnout in 2020 was around accessibility. Of course, it was during the pandemic, so there was mail-in ballots, there were drop-off ballots, there were increased poll workers. How will that change now in the 2022 midterms as a result of some of these laws that are being passed?
Yeah, I think we are going to need to get creative, and we're going to need to educate, and we're going to need to provide as much opportunity as we can. We still have the power of the vote. We are just restricted in our accommodation and access. And so, what we need to do is hopefully that expanded electorate really drill down with them and help to educate them and help them and encourage them to create a vote plan to come back out. But ultimately, we are still seeking a federal solution. I do think that we will not get the omnibus bill that we saw in the Freedom to Vote Act, or perhaps not even the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But my hope is that at least some of those provisions will make their way into other legislation prior to the election, so that we are going to be able to get some relief. So I don't want to give up on federal legislation quite yet.
And we are, of course, seeing local elections taking place in the aftermath of some of these votes coming in. So there might be an indication of maybe what's to come, albeit local elections tend to have a lower turnout anyway. But I know the city of Atlanta had its mayoral election. I mean, were there concerns about accessibility during any of these municipal elections that we're already seeing playing out?
Yes, absolutely. Because sadly, especially if you look again using Georgia as an example, not as the model, but rather the example. They recently had a mayor's race last cycle, and they did experience much lower than average turnout in a race that was frankly pretty darn competitive right down to the end. And so, these are indicators of what it looks like when we don't have access. And frankly, it really is damaging to our democracy. I mean, how in the world do we fight for freedoms around the world and we're not protecting our own freedoms here at home?
Well, as we are talking about representation on the Supreme Court and tying what's happening on the Supreme Court to voting rights, I have heard you say that voting is a gateway to representation. And I know that voting and voting access is a huge part. It's really your life's work. And so what are we looking at then with these voting laws in terms of who will be representing people, either in the state legislature, either in mayor's offices around the country, and certainly then at a federal and a congressional level?
Absolutely. Well, listen, we're fighting for representation at each and every level. We know at the local level, it's not just about who represents you on city council or who represents you in the state legislature. Those are certainly critically important, especially as we see redistricting being played out, sadly, more in the courts than in the legislature. But also because those people represent the folks who make up Board of Elections, some of which are appointed. They make up the folks who are our clerks who deal with the local election in your area. And they have a great deal of power too in administering the elections, even within following the law. And so, we want to that's why we look at leadership up and down the line. And it's why we need to continue to fight for protections, because a lot of those folks are really just trying to do good work. They believe in the vote, they believe in their jobs. This is why we start with voting as our civic participation, but we can't end with voting as our civic participation. It is our entry level, but it is by no means the completion of our path.
Well, we recently had as a guest on the show Dr. Amy Steele from the North Carolina Project, who herself had been a candidate for the state legislature there. And she talked about how gerrymandering has just created an absolute chaotic environment. The gerrymandering and the subsequent legal challenges against the gerrymandering. And so when we talk about representation and access to the ballot, there's also access to people who want to run. And so as you are there supporting Black women seeking these positions, you know, we talked earlier about the survey you're doing. I mean, what are the voting laws, the gerrymandering, the chaos that's often going along with all of that? What is that doing to people who feel, I could run, I have a lot of life experience, I have a lot of professional and educational experience, but this is just a quagmire at this point. This is too difficult an environment for me to step into. I mean, what are you hearing from Black women in that regard?
Well, you know, it's going to be a mixed bag. On the one hand, we have to recognize, just as though we see Black women coming with more experience, being better educated, having demonstrated more commitment in the communities and to public service. And so they come with this souped up resume, if you will. But they also have to recognize that even in putting themselves out there, that the attacks are coming. And so we have seen a historic number, and I think we will continue to see a historic number of women who are stepping out on even bigger platforms. And I think ultimately the women who make that choice because their commitment to their communities, frankly, outweigh the attacks that they are likely to receive. And they are willing to make that sacrifice in order to put forth the interests of their communities. And even in races where they're not successful, they're pushing the envelope on how the community talks about issues that are of prime concern to their communities.
I know you have a long history of being involved in politics, Holly. You know, your family as well. You can tell us about that. But I know that you first got involved, I think you were a teenager, around school board issues. So, you know, as we talk then about encouraging the next generation, not just of voters, but the next generation of political leaders, talk a little bit about your own experience and what prompted you to step into the space where you're not necessarily running for office, but you're there to support those who want to do that.
Yeah, you know, I grew up definitely in a political family in Kansas City, Missouri. My grandfather was elected. My father was elected. My mother says that she gave birth and it was in the middle of an election. We have spring elections in Kansas City. And so she had the baby, and a few days later, she bundled me up. And we were at that point licking stamp and putting out mailers. I don't remember that part, but I do remember being a teenager and being involved in door knocking campaigns. I remember having to stand up to my school board when they wanted to kick kids out of our school, and being a part of that. And I think I was raised with a very strong sense of justice, and I've been a fighter for justice. And I've recognized, I've tried to fight justice in many different ways as an attorney, as an advocate, and now I am fighting it by empowering others to fight the fight and to grow the movement of warriors for justice. So that's kind of been my path.
And what are your thoughts on how accessible or inaccessible our current political system is for young people? Of course, we're seeing a massive movement around issues like the environmental issue, Black Lives Matter, where young people really taking to the streets and getting involved in that. Are you seeing the same energy around elections and voting?
We are seeing an increased energy around elections and voting. I think what ultimately happens is whatever your gateway issue is into civic participation and especially advocacy, ultimately you realize that you've got to connect that to the vote, because many of these decisions are being made by the people who choose to represent you. Who, I should actually say that a different way, the people who you choose to represent you. And so as those connections are getting made, as that advocacy grows, voting rights and voting in general is certainly reaching and getting a lot more attention. I think also it's important to note that there are some significant barriers to entry depending on the kinds of races that you're trying to run, which is why we take a really holistic approach to politics. We certainly want to ensure that we have elected officials, but we want to also look at some of those opportunities that have less barriers to entry. Politics has become a very expensive game. And so even having access to resources can be a barrier in achieving a victory in some of those races. But that's one of the places, but not the only places that we're working with leaders around the country to expand their political leadership in all kinds of dynamic and creative ways.
Well, as we are just in the last few minutes, to bring the conversation back to where it started and the Supreme Court, the historic nomination and why that is significant. What are some of the next steps? Because some people, I think, feel, well, the nomination has been made, our work here is done. But I know your organization certainly is still working hard to make sure that this goes from a nomination to a confirmation. So for people who are excited, interested, paying attention to this particular issue, what would you say to them?
I would say visit our website at sisterslead.sistersvote.org. We have a number of opportunities for folks to get engaged, no matter what they like to do. If they like to make phone calls, we've got opportunity. If they like to be a part of signing petitions or letters or writing letters themselves, or getting engaged in actions or participating in forums, being interviewed, writing op-eds, whatever they like to do, we have a pathway for them to be engaged in this process. This process is important for us to have our voices be heard for several reasons. The next step is that this nominee must be voted out of committee, the Judiciary Committee. And so in that, that becomes the first time that the American public, outside of the information released by the White House and other groups, that they get to really hear from the nominee herself. And we want to make sure that we're not only watching her, but that we're watching our senators and that we're holding them accountable first to a fair and respectful process and a fair hearing of what this nominee has to say. And I think if they agree to do that, then there's no question that we should get a unanimous vote out of committee and ultimately unanimous vote on the floor. Once she passes through committee, then we are on the floor with our Senate vote. And again, while we only need 51% in order to move this forward, this nominee deserves 100% unanimous consent, both for her experience and her sense of representation on this bench.
And what would you advise people to watch for during that nomination, during those hearings? Some of the questions that some I'm sure will be overt in the subtext around race, but some might be more coded. What do you want people to really be paying attention to?
Yeah, context matters. So anything that's less than what she might be discussing as it relates to decisions, experience, ideology, you're looking for questions that really help you get to know who she is as a jurist. Of course, there'll be some things around background in terms of where she grew up, being born in DC, growing up in Miami. There may be some color and context there, but things that start to get into personal choices that she may have made, personal choices that may have been made by members of her family and her response to them or her opinions about them. Those are things that really need to be off bounds.
Well, Holli Holliday with Sisters Lead, Sisters Vote, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. This has been a delightful conversation.
Well, join us next week for another conversation on Just Solutions. But don't forget, we're also available as a podcast, so you can listen anytime. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.